Imagine stepping into your parents' home one morning, expecting warmth and familiarity, only to confront a horrifying scene that defies comprehension. Lily Thompson faced this on June 24, 1965, when she entered her parents' house in Houston, Texas. What she discovered inside would not only haunt her forever, but also captivate and terrify the nation. The brutal murders of Daniel and Margaret Thompson remain one of the most perplexing and chilling crimes in American history. Daniel and Margaret Thompson were the embodiment of quiet, unassuming lives. In his late 60s, Daniel had retired from a lifelong career as a truck driver. With his wife, Margaret, by his side, he spent his days in the modest comfort of their home. Margaret, in her 60s, grappled with health issues that confined her mostly indoors, but she found contentment in managing their household. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. Neighbors often saw Daniel sitting in his favorite chair by the window, newspaper in hand, while Margaret tended to small household tasks or prepared simple meals. Together, they were pillars of calm predictability in their suburban neighborhood. That predictability was shattered on the night of June 23, 1965. Unbeknownst to anyone, it would be the last night Daniel and Margaret would be seen alive. The next morning, their daughter Lily, a woman in her 30s with an air of quiet determination, arrived for her routine visit. She had spoken to her mother the day before and found nothing amiss. But as she opened the front door, an unsettling silence greeted her. The house, normally humming with the gentle sounds of her parents' routine, felt unnerving still. "Mom? Dad?" Lily called out, her voice echoing slightly in the oppressive quiet. No answer. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps on the wooden floor unnaturally loud. A faint chill seemed to seep from the walls, though it was the middle of summer. The ordinary had taken on an uncanny, almost sinister edge. As Lily entered the kitchen, her world tilted. The first thing she noticed was the refrigerator door, slightly ajar. A dark stain trailed faintly across the tiled floor. With growing dread, she reached out and pulled the door open. What she saw inside would forever sear itself into her memory. Body parts, severed, neatly arranged. Her parents' dismembered limbs, their heads, arms, and legs, were packed into the icebox with grotesque precision. The torsos were missing, later discovered in the adjacent living room, wrapped in sheets. The air was heavy with a metallic tang of blood, mingled with the cold sterility of the refrigerator. It was a sight that defied reason, a tableau of brutality so extreme that Lily's mind struggled to process it. For a moment, she stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Then came the scream, raw and primal, tearing through the eerie silence of the house. Shaking violently, Lily stumbled back, fumbling for the telephone. Her hands trembled as she dialed the police. Her voice, barely coherent, broke through the receiver. "My parents, they're dead. Someone killed them. They're in the refrigerator." When the police arrived, even the most seasoned officers were taken aback by the scene. The murders were not only brutal, but methodically executed. The precision of the dismemberment suggested a level of planning and detachment that was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was something far more calculated. Yet, as investigators began to piece together the fragments of that night, the picture that emerged was anything but clear. The Thompson home, once a haven of quiet domesticity, became a crime scene that confounded authorities and chilled the community to its core. How could such violence erupt in the lives of such unassuming people? And who could harbor the capacity for such calculated cruelty? The answers lay tangled in a web of family secrets, unspoken resentments, and a mystery that would only deepen as the investigation unfolded. But one thing was clear from the very beginning. The one person who might have had the answers, their son Charles, was nowhere to be found. The morning of June 24, 1965, began like any other for Lily Thompson. The sun was already blazing in the Houston sky as she pulled into her parents' driveway. She had visited often to check on her aging parents, Daniel and Margaret, and this day was no different. But as she approached the house, an unsettling quiet greeted her. Something felt wrong. Margaret and Daniel were creatures of habit. They would typically be in the kitchen around this time, sharing coffee and discussing the day ahead. Yet today, no familiar sounds of clinking cups or murmured conversation greeted her. Lily's instincts prickled with unease as she called out, "Mom? Dad?" Silence answered her. Lily stepped cautiously into the house, her heels clicking against the tiled floor of the entryway. The air inside was oppressively still, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. She moved toward the kitchen, her pulse quickening with each step. When she reached the doorway, the scene before her stopped her cold. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, and a dark streak marred the pristine white tile beneath it. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her breath shallow and uneven. With a trembling grip, she pulled the door open. Inside, the sight defied logic and human comprehension. Severed limbs, arms, legs, heads, were carefully placed on the shelves, their grotesque neatness only amplifying the horror. The blood-streaked refrigerator hummed softly, an eerie counterpoint to the gruesome display. Her parents' torsos were missing, though they would later be discarded elsewhere in the house. Lily's scream erupted, raw and unfiltered, piercing the oppressive silence of the house. She staggered back, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse as she fumbled for the phone. The receiver felt like a lifeline as she dialed, her shaking hands struggling to press the numbers. When the operator answered, Lily's voice cracked with hysteria. "My parents, they're dead. Someone murdered them." Moments later, the sound of sirens cut through the oppressive quiet, heralding the arrival of the police. Officers entered the Thompson home, their confident strides faltering as they encountered the scene. Seasoned investigators who had witnessed their share of horrors found themselves shaken. This wasn't a crime of impulse. The sheer meticulousness of the dismemberment suggested a chilling, deliberate mind behind it. The living room revealed the torsos, wrapped in sheets and arranged with a grotesque precision. The meticulous nature of the scene left no doubt. This killer had planned every detail. The brutality spoke of rage, but the precision hinted at something even darker, a cold, calculated detachment. Detectives began their work, cataloging evidence and questioning neighbors. Everyone in the tight-knit community struggled to reconcile the Thompsons' gentle reputations with the savagery of the crime. Nothing had been stolen, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if the killer had known them, had been someone they trusted. As the investigation unfolded, a name surfaced almost immediately: Charles Thompson, their only son. Charles, a troubled man in his late 20s, had long been estranged from his parents. Neighbors described him as reclusive, prone to erratic behavior, and frequently at odds with his father. Most chillingly, Charles was nowhere to be found. The search for Charles began with urgency, but questions loomed. Was he the architect of this horrifying act? Or was someone else responsible, lurking in the shadows, their motives hidden behind the Thompsons' bloodied walls? The answers, as the police would soon discover, were as elusive as they were unsettling. The discovery of Daniel and Margaret Thompson's mutilated bodies sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known the elderly couple for years were left reeling, their serene neighborhood now the epicenter of a grisly tragedy. But for the investigators, the scene raised one pressing question: who could commit such a heinous act? Initial suspicions pointed to Charles Thompson. As Daniel and Margaret's only son, Charles had long been a source of concern. In his late 20s, he was known for his reclusive nature and erratic behavior. He had distanced himself from his parents over the years, and their relationship had been strained by frequent arguments, often about money. The most recent fight, only weeks earlier, had revolved around Charles's unauthorized sale of his father's property. To those who knew him, Charles was an enigma. As a child, he had been quiet and withdrawn, preferring solitude to the company of others. By the time he reached adulthood, his isolation had deepened. He struggled to hold down jobs, frequently clashing with employers and coworkers. Neighbors recalled seeing him pacing in his parents' yard late at night, muttering to himself. His odd behavior, combined with his history of conflict with Daniel, made him a natural suspect. The day before the murders, neighbors reported seeing Charles at the Thompson house. He was described as agitated, his gestures animated as he argued with his father on the front porch. That night, a neighbor claimed to have heard shouting from inside the home, though they couldn't make out the words. By morning, Charles was gone, and Daniel and Margaret were dead. Despite these circumstantial pieces of evidence, the case was far from clear-cut. The brutality of the crime, the meticulous dismemberment, and the careful arrangement of the bodies didn't align with the impulsive violence of a domestic dispute. Investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Charles's disappearance only deepened the mystery. No one had seen or heard from him since the night of the murders. His car was missing, and there were no records of him boarding a bus or a train. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As detectives delved deeper into Charles's life, they uncovered troubling details. He had a history of mental health struggles, marked by periods of paranoia and violent outbursts. Friends and acquaintances described him as deeply resentful of his father, whom he saw as overbearing and controlling. But while these revelations painted a picture of a troubled man, they didn't provide concrete evidence linking him to the murders. The police also considered other possibilities. Could the crime have been committed by someone outside the family? A stranger with a vendetta or a twisted desire for violence? The lack of forced entry suggested the killer had been someone the Thompsons knew and trusted. Yet, as investigators scoured the couple's lives for other suspects, they found no one with a motive as compelling as Charles's. The media quickly latched onto the story, dubbing it the Thompson Murders. Headlines speculated about Charles's involvement, painting him as a deranged killer on the run. The sensational coverage only added to the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case. As days turned into weeks, the search for Charles intensified. Police distributed wanted posters, combed through his known hangouts, and interviewed anyone who might have seen him. But every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The absence of physical evidence tying Charles to the crime scene only added to the frustration. Despite the mounting questions, one truth remained undeniable. Whoever had committed this atrocity had done so with a level of precision and detachment that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. The Thompson murders were no ordinary crime, and the answers, if they ever came, promised to be as shocking as the crime itself. Charles Thompson had always been an enigma, a puzzle no one could quite solve. Even as a child, his solitary tendencies set him apart. He was the boy who preferred the quiet company of books and drawings to the noise of playground games. Teachers noted his intelligence, but worried about his social isolation. As he grew older, that isolation deepened, transforming into something darker and more unsettling. To his parents, Charles was both a source of love and a source of heartache. Margaret often fretted over his inability to form meaningful relationships, while Daniel grew frustrated with Charles's apparent aimlessness. Arguments between father and son were frequent, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the modest Thompson home. Despite this, Margaret had always believed that her son's struggles stemmed from a place of pain rather than malice. By the time Charles reached his late 20s, his relationship with his parents had deteriorated further. He drifted in and out of jobs, often leaving after clashes with co-workers or managers. His temper was unpredictable, and he was known for brooding over perceived slights. The neighbors noticed his increasingly erratic behavior, with one recalling a night when they saw Charles pacing in the yard, gesticulating wildly as if arguing with someone who wasn't there. In the weeks leading up to the murders, tensions between Charles and his father had reached a boiling point. The sale of a piece of Daniel's property without permission had sparked a particularly heated argument. Neighbors heard shouting, doors slamming, and the unmistakable sound of something breaking inside the house. Daniel had reportedly told a friend that he didn't know what to do with his son anymore, describing him as a lost cause. Despite these signs of discord, no one could have predicted the horrors that unfolded. As investigators pieced together Charles's recent actions, a troubling picture emerged. He had been seen entering his parents' home the evening before their bodies were discovered. Witnesses described his demeanor as agitated, his movements hurried. And then, just as suddenly, he vanished. The search for Charles became the central focus of the investigation. Detectives uncovered a history of mental health struggles, including paranoia and delusions that had gone untreated for years. Friends described him as someone who felt perpetually misunderstood, harboring deep resentment toward his father's authority. Yet, even with this background, the sheer brutality of the crime seemed incongruous with the Charles they knew. Adding to the mystery was the meticulous nature of the murders. The dismemberment of the bodies required both physical strength and a certain level of anatomical knowledge. Was Charles capable of such cold precision, or had he enlisted the help of someone else? These questions haunted the detectives as they combed through the evidence. Amidst the growing suspicion around Charles, another possibility began to take shape. Could he have been a victim as well? The lack of physical evidence tying him directly to the crime scene left room for doubt. Some investigators theorized that Charles might have been coerced or manipulated into involvement by a more calculating individual. Others feared that he had met with foul play himself, silenced by the true perpetrator. The community's reaction to the case was one of collective unease. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of Charles as a troubled yet harmless loner with the monstrous acts that had occurred. The media, however, painted a far less sympathetic portrait. Headlines screamed of a deranged killer on the run, amplifying public fear and speculation. As the weeks dragged on, the trail grew colder. Charles's car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town, but it offered no clues. His bank account remained untouched, and there were no sightings to confirm he was still alive. The manhunt continued, but with every passing day, the possibility of finding Charles diminished. For the Thompson family's friends and the investigators, the uncertainty was unbearable. Was Charles the killer, consumed by years of resentment and mental instability? Or was he another victim, caught in a web of manipulation and violence? The answers lay hidden, shrouded in the same darkness that had enveloped the quiet Thompson home on that fateful night. The Thompson murders thrust the Houston police into one of the most gruesome and perplexing cases in their history. The savagery of the crime, combined with the apparent lack of clear evidence, left investigators scrambling for answers. As the media frenzy intensified, the pressure on law enforcement to deliver justice mounted. From the start, Charles Thompson was their prime suspect. His disappearance, coupled with his tumultuous history with his parents, painted him as the most likely perpetrator. Yet, as detectives delved deeper, they found the case far more complex than it initially appeared. The crime scene itself was a study in contradictions. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the Thompsons had let their killer in willingly. The meticulous dismemberment of the bodies pointed to a level of planning and detachment that was deeply unsettling. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence directly tying Charles to the scene. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only horror and questions. Investigators focused their initial efforts on reconstructing Charles's movements in the days leading up to the murders. Witness accounts placed him at his parents' home the night before the crime, but after that his trail went cold. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with Charles, hoping to unearth a lead. Some neighbors described him as increasingly erratic in recent weeks, prone to bursts of anger and paranoia. Others mentioned seeing a strange car parked near the Thompson residence late that evening, though no one could recall specific details. In their search for answers, detectives turned to Charles's personal life. They uncovered a history of financial disputes between him and his father. Daniel had reportedly cut Charles off financially, refusing to support him after a series of failed jobs and questionable decisions. This tension had boiled over during their last argument, adding weight to the theory that Charles's actions were fueled by resentment and rage. Yet, as the investigation progressed, cracks began to form in the narrative of Charles as the sole perpetrator. The level of precision involved in the murders seemed beyond what an emotionally unstable individual could execute in the heat of anger. Some investigators began to wonder if Charles had acted alone, or if he had acted at all. Was it possible that someone else had manipulated him or exploited his fragile mental state to carry out the crime? This theory gained traction when forensic analysts examined the crime scene in greater detail. Small anomalies, scratches on the floor, An odd indentation near the refrigerator suggested the possibility of multiple individuals being involved. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling enough to warrant a closer look. The media's portrayal of the case only complicated matters. Headlines branded Charles a killer on the run, while television broadcasts speculated wildly about his motives. The public's hunger for answers turned into a frenzy, with amateur sleuths offering theories ranging from Charles being part of a cult to the involvement of an unknown third party. The noise surrounding the case made it difficult for investigators to separate fact from fiction. Amid the chaos, the police received an anonymous tip claiming that Charles had been seen in a small town on the outskirts of Houston. Officers followed the lead, scouring the area, but found no trace of him. The tipster's information was vague, offering little beyond a description of a man who might have been Charles buying food at a gas station. Once again, the trail led nowhere. Despite the setbacks, detectives remained determined. They revisited the crime scene, re-interviewed witnesses, and re-examined every piece of evidence. Theories began to shift. Was Charles the killer, or was he a pawn in a larger, more sinister game? And if he was innocent, where was he? The questions hung over the investigation like a dark cloud, their weight growing heavier with each passing day. As weeks turned into months, the urgency to solve the case grew, but so did the frustration. Every lead seemed to spiral into dead ends, and the lack of solid evidence made progress agonizingly slow. For the detectives, the Thompson murders were no longer just a case. They were an obsession, a haunting reminder of the thin line between order and chaos. With Charles still missing and no definitive answers in sight, the Thompson murders took on an almost mythic quality, a dark tale that captivated and horrified the public in equal measure. But for the police, it remained a grim, unfinished puzzle, one they were determined to solve, no matter how long it took. Months passed, and the Thompson murders seemed destined to become yet another unsolved case. The public's interest, initially feverish, began to wane as other headlines captured attention. For the detectives assigned to the case, however, the work never stopped. They scoured every lead, no matter how tenuous, hoping to find a break they so desperately needed. Then, just when the investigation seemed to be at a standstill, an unexpected tip reignited hope. An anonymous caller claimed to have seen Charles Thompson in a small town on the outskirts of Houston weeks after the murders. The tipster provided details about a man staying at a rundown motel, keeping to himself and acting nervously. Investigators were skeptical but couldn't afford to ignore any possibility. Detectives rushed to the town and interviewed the motel owner. The description matched Charles, a disheveled man in his late 20s, avoiding eye contact and paying in cash. The owner remembered him clearly, as he rarely left his room except to buy food from a nearby diner. Charles had used a fake name, but a search of the room confirmed his identity. By the time detectives arrived, however, he was gone. The room offered few clues. What they did find, though, raised new questions. Among Charles's belongings was a small, battered box containing photographs. Most were mundane family snapshots, but a few stood out. They featured Charles with a man no one recognized, a lean, middle-aged figure with sharp features and an unsettling gaze. The two appeared in multiple settings, parks, backyards, and once outside the Thompson home. Who was this man, and what was his connection to Charles? Detectives pursued this new angle, showing the photos to neighbors and friends of the Thompsons. One neighbor remembered seeing the mysterious man near the house late at night a few times, but couldn't recall his name. This lead opened the door to a chilling possibility. What if Charles hadn't acted alone? What if someone else had orchestrated the crime or even carried it out? Further investigation into the photographs uncovered a potential lead. Forensic analysis revealed faint writing on the back of one, an address scrawled hastily in pencil. The address led to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Inside a unit rented under a false name, detectives found tools, rolls of plastic sheeting, and a bloodstained shirt. The blood was later confirmed to belong to Daniel Thompson. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a complication. The tools suggested premeditation, and the presence of another person's belongings deepened the mystery. If Charles was involved, he might not have been the mastermind. If this unknown individual had manipulated Charles, then the investigation had taken a much darker turn. The mysterious man's identity became the focus of the case. Detectives combed through local records and questioned anyone who might know him, but the trail was frustratingly elusive. Witnesses described him as off-putting and intense, with a presence that left an uneasy impression. Those who recognized him spoke of a man who seemed to operate on the fringes of society, keeping his interactions brief and his intentions hidden. This new lead reignited media interest in the Thompson murders. The narrative shifted from a simple case of familial violence to something far more sinister. Headlines speculated about shadowy accomplices and dark conspiracies, feeding the public's appetite for sensationalism. For the detectives, though, the case remained grounded in grim reality, a brutal double murder with no clear answers. As the investigation continued, one question loomed larger than ever. Was Charles a victim of manipulation, or had he willingly participated in the horror that befell his parents? The battered box of photographs hinted at a relationship that held the key to the mystery. Yet, as detectives sifted through the clues, the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. With each new discovery, the Thompson murders grew more complex, a labyrinth of secrets and lies that seemed to stretch endlessly. The case was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about uncovering the darkest corners of human behavior. And at the heart of it all, Charles Thompson remained an enigma, his fate as unclear as his role in the tragedy that had shattered his family. The discovery of the photographs in Charles Thompson's belongings introduced a chilling new dimension to the investigation. Who was the man with the sharp features and piercing gaze? What connection did he have to Charles, and more disturbingly, to the murders of Daniel and Margaret Thompson? These questions became the new focus for detectives, who were determined to unravel the mystery. The photographs were taken to a forensic specialist for closer examination. Analysis revealed faint but discernible details in the backgrounds. A park bench with a distinctive carving, a street sign partially obscured by a tree. These small clues gave detectives a starting point. They worked tirelessly to identify the locations, hoping the settings would lead them to the man in the photographs. Their efforts bore fruit when one of the locations was identified as a public park just miles from the Thompson home. Witnesses who frequented the park were interviewed, and one elderly man recalled seeing Charles with the unidentified man several times over the course of a few weeks. They didn't look like friends, he said. The other man seemed in charge. Charles looked nervous around him. This description added to the growing suspicion that the man in the photographs was no casual acquaintance. He appeared to exert an unsettling influence over Charles, a dynamic that raised the possibility of coercion or manipulation. Detectives began to suspect that this man might have played a central role in the murders. Further inquiries revealed a name: Richard Doyle. Doyle was a drifter with a history of petty crimes and a reputation for being deeply charismatic, yet dangerously unpredictable. He had lived on the fringes of society, moving frequently and avoiding deep connections. Those who knew him described him as someone who could charm his way into people's lives and exploit their vulnerabilities for his own ends. Investigators dug into Doyle's background and uncovered troubling details. He had a criminal record that included charges of burglary and assault, and he was known to associate with individuals who shared his disdain for authority and societal norms. Most chillingly, Doyle had been in Houston at the time of the murders, living in a boarding house just a few blocks from the Thompson home. Armed with this new information, detectives interviewed the landlord of the boarding house. She recalled Doyle as an unnerving tenant who kept odd hours and rarely spoke to anyone. He was quiet, but not in a good way, she said. You could feel something wasn't right with him. She also remembered him leaving abruptly one night, carrying a large bag and muttering under his breath. This departure coincided with the time frame of the murders. Detectives now had a name, a face, and a possible motive. They theorized that Doyle might have manipulated Charles into participating in the crime or used him as a scapegoat. The possibility that Doyle had orchestrated the murders while remaining in the shadows added a layer of complexity to an already baffling case. But finding Doyle proved to be a daunting task. He had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only fragmented clues. Detectives issued a warrant for his arrest and distributed his photograph to law enforcement agencies across the state. Meanwhile, the media latched onto the new development, branding Doyle as a potential mastermind and intensifying public interest in the case. As the search for Doyle continued, detectives revisited the idea that Charles might have been a victim rather than a perpetrator. The dynamic captured in the photographs, coupled with witness accounts, painted a picture of a young man under significant duress. Yet questions remained. Had Charles willingly gone along with Doyle's plans, or had he been coerced through fear and manipulation? The deeper detectives dug, the more the Thompson murders seemed like a tragic confluence of toxic relationships and unchecked violence. Doyle's shadow loomed large over the case, his presence felt in every grim detail. The man in the photographs was no longer just a figure of interest. He was the key to understanding the horror that had unfolded in the Thompson home. With each passing day, the urgency to find Richard Doyle grew. Detectives knew that unraveling his connection to Charles and the murders was their best chance at solving the case. But as the trail grew colder, they were left to grapple with an unsettling truth. Some killers don't just vanish into the night. They disappear into the cracks of a fractured world, taking their secrets with them. The discovery of Richard Doyle as a possible accomplice, or even the mastermind behind the Thompson's murders, added a new urgency to the investigation. Richard's criminal record, his connection to Charles Thompson, and the cryptic photos found in the motel room painted a troubling picture. The police now believed they were dealing with not just one suspect, but two, and perhaps a conspiracy far darker than they had anticipated. Detectives immediately began tracking Richard's movements. His criminal history revealed that he was no stranger to vanishing when things got too heated. He had evaded arrest in the past, changing names and blending into new towns with ease. Still, the police were determined not to let him slip away this time. They scoured nearby cities and towns, questioning anyone who might have seen him. The break they needed came when they visited a gas station in a small desert town 2 hours west of Houston. The station owner remembered a man matching Richard's description who had stopped by a few weeks earlier. The man had been driving an old, beat-up pickup truck and appeared nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. The owner also remembered something unusual. The man had asked for directions to a remote area near the Texas-Mexico border, a place locals referred to as the ghost town. This clue sent detectives racing to the area, but what they found only deepened the mystery. In the abandoned town, they discovered a dilapidated house that showed signs of recent occupation. Inside, there were empty food containers, discarded clothing, and a pile of ashes in the fireplace. It was clear that someone had been staying there, but whoever it was had left in a hurry. Among the items left behind was a torn piece of a photograph, a fragment that perfectly matched one of the photos found in Charles's motel room. The discovery connected Richard to the crime, but it also raised more questions. Why had Richard fled to such a remote location? And why had he left in such a rush? The police now had enough evidence to formally name Richard Doyle as a person of interest in the case, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. But finding him was proving to be as difficult as solving the murders themselves. Meanwhile, the public's interest in the Thompson's murders was at an all-time high. News of the new suspect spread quickly, and media outlets were buzzing with theories. Some believed that Richard had manipulated Charles into committing the murders, preying on his fragile mental state and resentment toward his parents. Others suggested that Richard might have been the killer all along, using his friendship with Charles as a cover. And then there were those who thought both men were equally guilty, working together to carry out the gruesome crime. As the hunt for Richard intensified, the police continued to piece together his connection to Charles. They discovered that the two men had met at a halfway house several years earlier. Charles had been struggling with his mental health at the time, and Richard had quickly befriended him. It was a toxic relationship from the start, with Richard dominating and controlling Charles. Those who knew them said that Richard had a way of getting inside people's heads, twisting their thoughts until they didn't know what was real anymore. The more the police learned about Richard, the more they began to see him as the key to solving the case. But as days turned into weeks, he remained elusive. Every lead seemed to end in another dead end, and the trail grew colder with each passing day. Despite the setbacks, the detectives refused to give up. They knew that Richard Doyle held the answers to the Thompson's murders. But finding him would take more than just determination. It would take luck, skill, and the ability to stay one step ahead of a man who had made a career out of disappearing. The search for Richard Doyle was relentless, pushing detectives to their limits as they pursued every possible lead. Weeks stretched into months, and Doyle seemed to vanish like a shadow, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and the haunting memory of his crimes. Yet, even as frustration mounted, investigators refused to waver. They were determined to capture the man they believed held the key to the Thompson murders. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. A patrol officer stationed near the Texas-Mexico border spotted an old pickup truck abandoned at a roadside checkpoint. The vehicle matched the description of one Doyle who had been seen driving during a prior sighting. Inside, investigators found a blood-stained knife, a torn map of Houston, and a notebook filled with cryptic entries. One phrase, scrawled repeatedly, sent chills through the detectives. The bonds must break. The blood on the knife was later identified as belonging to Daniel Thompson, further cementing Doyle's connection to the murders. The notebook, however, raised new questions. Its disjointed, almost manic passages alternated between ramblings about control and freedom and chilling references to pulling the strings. The entries hinted at a warped ideology, suggesting that Doyle saw himself as an orchestrator of chaos, manipulating others to carry out his vision. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through the abandoned truck, uncovering additional clues. A receipt from a diner in El Paso, dated just days earlier, placed Doyle firmly in the area. Investigators rushed to the diner, where employees confirmed serving a man matching Doyle's description. According to their accounts, Doyle had been jittery and evasive, barely making eye contact and leaving in a hurry. One waitress recalled him muttering something about heading south, further fueling suspicions that he intended to cross the border. With this new lead, detectives coordinated with border authorities, intensifying their efforts to cut off Doyle's escape route. Checkpoints were reinforced, and search teams scoured nearby desert towns and remote hideouts. The pressure was mounting, and Doyle's window for evasion was rapidly closing. The turning point came when a rancher reported seeing a man camping in an abandoned barn on his property, roughly 20 miles from the border. The rancher described the man as unkempt and paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. Detectives descended on the location, carefully surrounding the barn under the cover of darkness. Armed with the knowledge of Doyle's violent tendencies, they approached cautiously, fully aware that their target might resist capture. As dawn broke, the officers made their move. Shouting commands, they stormed the barn, weapons drawn. Inside, they found Doyle huddled in a corner, his gaunt frame trembling with exhaustion. His wild eyes darted frantically around the room, but there was nowhere left to run. After a tense standoff, he surrendered, muttering incoherently about broken chains and their freedom. Richard Doyle's capture sent shockwaves through the community and brought a sense of relief to the detectives who had spent months chasing him. Yet, as they transported him back to Houston for questioning, they knew their work was far from over. Doyle's arrest marked the end of the manhunt, but the beginning of unraveling the full story behind the Thompson murders. During his initial interrogation, Doyle was both cryptic and defiant. He refused to admit to the murders outright, instead speaking in riddles about the strings of control and setting the stage. Detectives pressed him on his relationship with Charles Thompson, hoping to determine whether Charles had acted as Doyle's accomplice or his pawn. Doyle's responses were maddeningly vague, alternating between claims of innocence and thinly veiled boasts about his ability to manipulate others. One statement stood out: Charles was always searching for freedom. I just showed him the way. The chilling remark suggested that Doyle had exploited Charles's vulnerabilities, using him as a tool to carry out his twisted vision. But without Charles to corroborate or refute Doyle's claims, the truth remained frustratingly elusive. As news of Doyle's capture spread, public interest in the case reignited. The media descended on Houston, eager for updates on the man who had become a symbol of fear and chaos. Theories about his motives and the extent of his crimes proliferated, further muddying the waters. Yet, for the Thompson family's friends and neighbors, one question overshadowed all others. What had happened to Charles? Despite Doyle's arrest, Charles's whereabouts remained unknown. The possibility that he had fled, taken his own life, or fallen victim to Doyle's schemes haunted investigators. The search for answers continued, driven by the hope of bringing closure to a case that had left so many scars. As Doyle awaited trial, detectives sifted through the mountain of evidence they had collected, piecing together the fragmented narrative of the Thompson murders. The truth was tangled, elusive, and deeply unsettling. But with Doyle in custody, one thing was certain: the hunt for justice was far from over. Richard Doyle's capture marked a pivotal moment in the Thompson murders case, but it was far from the end. The detectives knew that Doyle's cryptic statements and manipulative tendencies meant uncovering the full truth would be a battle of wits. As he sat in the interrogation room, Doyle exuded a chilling calm, his demeanor oscillating between defiance and smug amusement. His words were riddled with ambiguities, but beneath them lay the potential key to understanding the tragedy that had devastated the Thompson family. "I didn't kill them," Doyle said during his first official interview. "But I did set them free. Charles, though, he did what he had to do. He's the one who broke the chains." The detectives pressed him for details, but Doyle remained maddeningly evasive, offering only cryptic hints about his relationship with Charles and their alleged shared ideology. Investigators pieced together what they could from Doyle's fragmented confessions, the evidence they had collected, and witness testimonies. It became increasingly clear that Doyle had played a central role in the murders, not as the one who wielded the knife, but as the puppeteer pulling the strings. He had preyed on Charles Thompson's vulnerabilities, his resentment toward his father, his fragile mental state, and his desperate desire for freedom. The journal found in Doyle's possession offered chilling insights into his mind. Scrawled across its pages were ramblings about control, power, and liberating others from the prisons of their lives. Several entries referred directly to Charles, describing him as a soul ripe for guidance. One passage stood out: "Together, we will dismantle the ties that bind. He is my instrument, and I am his liberation." While the journal solidified Doyle's role as the mastermind, it did little to clarify Charles's current whereabouts. Detectives scoured every lead, hoping to locate him and understand his role in the murders. Despite their efforts, Charles remained a ghost, his fate shrouded in mystery. Some investigators speculated that he had fled out of guilt, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Others feared a darker possibility: that Doyle had manipulated Charles into not only committing the murders but also disappearing forever, silenced to ensure he could never tell his side of the story. As Doyle's trial approached, public interest in the case reached a fever pitch. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators eager to witness the proceedings. Doyle, ever the manipulator, seemed to revel in the attention. He frequently smirked during testimony and offered cryptic comments when addressed by the prosecution. The evidence presented was damning. Forensic analysts testified about the bloodstained shirt and knife found in Doyle's possession, both of which linked him to the crime scene. Witnesses recounted his manipulative behavior and his association with Charles. But the most chilling moment came when the prosecution read aloud excerpts from Doyle's journal, laying bare his twisted ideology and his calculated efforts to exploit Charles. Despite Doyle's attempts to downplay his involvement, the jury was unmoved. After deliberating for only a few hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder. Doyle was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction brought some measure of justice for Daniel and Margaret Thompson, but for their surviving family and friends, the lingering question of Charles's fate cast a long shadow over the closure they sought. Years passed, and the Thompson murders faded from the headlines, but the case remained an enduring mystery. Occasionally, rumors surfaced about sightings of a man resembling Charles in distant towns or remote areas, but none were ever substantiated. Some believed he had started a new life under an assumed identity, while others feared he had succumbed to the weight of his guilt. For the detectives who had worked the case, The Thompson murders were a haunting reminder of the complexities of human nature, how manipulation, resentment, and mental instability could culminate in unimaginable violence. While they had brought Doyle to justice, the absence of definitive answers about Charles left a void that no conviction could fill. The Thompson murders became a cautionary tale, a story of a family torn apart by unseen forces and a manipulator who thrived on chaos. It was a case that challenged the boundaries of justice, leaving behind as many questions as answers. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, one truth endured. The scars of that horrific night would never fade, a chilling testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary lives. The Thompson murders remain one of the most chilling and enigmatic cases in true crime history. It's a haunting reminder of how the ripple effects of manipulation, resentment, and violence can shatter even the most unassuming lives. What do you think happened to Charles Thompson? Was he a willing participant in the tragedy, or a victim ensnared by a master manipulator?